Hello, my name is Renette Winty Biggs and I hold the South African Research Chair in Social Ecological Systems and Resilience, and I'm jointly based at the Centre for Complex Systems in Transition at Stellenbosch University in South Africa and the Stockholm Resilience Centre at Stockholm University in Sweden. And this chapter focuses on principles for building resilience. So resilience thinking is one emerging approach to sustainability, focusing specifically on the capacity to deal with change in social ecological systems, and especially unexpected change. And an underlying assumption of the resilience thinking approach is that social ecological systems are complex adaptive systems, which is very important for the way in which we govern and manage them. So this chapter focuses specifically on how do we build resilience, or the capacity to deal with change and especially unexpected change. So studies have identified 7 general principles that can be used to integrate resilience thinking into development practice. These principles are not blueprints or exhaustive, but have been found to hold across a diverse set of systems and contexts. And in this chapter, I'll be stepping through each of these principles. So principle 1 is maintain diversity and redundancy. Diversity refers to a diversity of species, actors, or institutions that can respond differently to shocks or change. But what is especially important is if we have different species or elements of a social ecological system that can perform the same system function, which is known as redundancy, because this can help maintain critical ecosystem services and human well-being in the face of disturbance and change. For example, planting different types of crops that are resistant to different types of pests can help ensure food supply even if there is an outbreak of a particular pest. However, it is important to remember that more diversity is not always better. For example, a high diversity of stakeholders or values can reduce the potential for agreement to enable successful responses to change. Principle 2 focuses on managing connectivity in systems. Connectivity refers to the degree to which resources, species, and people interact or disperse in a social ecological system, and can enhance resilience by providing links to sources of recovery after a disturbance or a shock and building trust in social networks. For example, if a fire destroys a particular village, having social ties to other villages can help provide the manpower and resources to rebuild the village. If connectivity is too high, however, a localized disturbance can spread throughout the system, or knowledge can become overly homogenized. Intermediate levels of connectivity are therefore often provide the most resilience. Principle 3 focuses on managing slowly changing variables and feedbacks. Slowly changing variables and feedbacks underlie different social ecological configurations or regimes. And feedbacks refer to where a change in one factor in a social ecological system leads to a series of changes that eventually feed back to affect the original factor that changed. If changes in a social ecological system exceed a critical threshold level, the system may abruptly and unexpectedly undergo dramatic changes that causes a reorganization of the system, known as a regime shift. And this reorganization of the system or alternative configuration of the system can have very marked consequences for ecosystem services and human well-being. For example, if grazing exceeds a critical threshold level in a savanna, which consists of a mixture of trees and grass, this savanna system may shift, often quite abruptly, into a shrub or tree-dominated state where cattle ranching becomes impossible. Slow variables and feedbacks that underlie different social ecological regimes are often difficult to identify. However, we do know that regulating services such as climate regulation and informal social networks may be key slow variables for maintaining resilience. So principles 1 to 3, which I've just spoken through, focus on general social and ecological properties of a system that need to be governed to build resilience. I'll now move on to speaking about principles 4 to 7, which focuses on properties of the governance system that are required to build resilience. So principle 4 focuses on fostering complex adaptive systems thinking. This refers to a worldview that appreciates the properties of social ecological systems as complex adaptive systems, especially properties such as high levels of uncertainty associated with these systems, the potential for nonlinear change, such as regime shifts, and the need for considering multiple perspectives in order to understand the system. There is some evidence that complex systems thinking is associated with the adoption of management approaches that are more flexible and adaptive. However, most evidence for the need for complex systems thinking comes from the negative consequences of linear reductionist worldviews and command and control approaches. For example, building rigid levees to control river flow can inadvertently increase flooding levels by encouraging people to build closer to the river. Principle 5 focuses on encouraging learning. Learning through experimentation and monitoring, as well as through collaboration and co-production of knowledge, is essential to enable adaptation in response to ongoing change in social ecological systems. For example, climate warming required long-term monitoring and detailed studies and synthesis initiatives, such as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, known as the IPCC, to detect that it was occurring. Learning requires trust and appropriate relationships and institutions to flourish. For example, public research agencies and universities, as well as learning processes in government agencies and business. Principle 6 is closely linked to Principle 5 and focuses on broadening participation. Active engagement of relevant stakeholders in the management and governance processes of social ecological systems is important for building trust and relationships and facilitating the learning and collective action needed to respond to change and shocks. To ensure successful participation, a nuanced understanding is needed of who participates, under which conditions participation is appropriate, and how participation takes place. Finally, Principle 7 focuses on promoting polycentric governance systems. Polycentricity refers to multiple interacting governing bodies with the autonomy to make and enforce rules within a specific policy, arena, and geography. For example, a nature reserve that falls under a local city authority, but is also part of the International Biosphere Reserve System, and has a local Friends of the Nature Reserve coalition that helps manage it. Polycentric governance structures help enable other resilience-enhancing principles, especially learning and experimentation, participation, connectivity, and diversity and redundancy. Coordination amongst governance units, negotiation of trade-offs between users, and social capital and trust are essential for effective polycentric arrangements. Finally, to conclude, it is very important to consider, before applying any of the principles, the question of resilience of what to what and for whom. Firstly, resilience of what? In the case of sustainability and social ecological systems, the desired output or outcome of building resilience is to enhance human well-being and the critical ecosystem services which underpin human well-being. When we think about resilience to what, in general, we are talking about resilience to slower ongoing change, as well as unexpected shocks. Finally, it is very important to consider resilience for whom. Who benefits and loses? Does building resilience entrench or exacerbate existing inequalities? If this is the case, one may need to reconsider the question of what one is building resilience to. Finally, it is important to keep in mind that the different principles interact with one another and are often interdependent. Thank you.